Hello everyone and welcome back. In this lecture we are going to start looking into server-side request forgery or SSRF vulnerability in our APIs. We will understand this vulnerability, its impact, and then how we can fix it using our hands-on exercise on our sample application. Now, SSRF is a type of security vulnerability that occurs when an API fetches a remote resource without properly validating the user supplied URL. So, in simple words, in this case, the URL is supplied by the client, and then server without any validation simply executes that URL, or an attacker can create a crafted URL which gets executed on the server. Now this allows an attacker to manipulate the API endpoint and make the targeted server perform unintended actions. Now how does server-side request forgery or SSRF work? Now generally there are two steps. The attacker finds an API endpoint that accesses a URI provided by the client, and then once they find it, because of lack of validation, the API does not validate the user supplied URL, and then attacker takes advantage of it. Now some of the example of SSRF exploitation are: it could be a social network allowing user to upload profile pictures, but users can provide the URL of an image instead of uploading a file. An attacker can send a malicious URL that triggers an API call to an internal network resource where your social networking site is hosted. This will allow them to perform port scanning or gather sensitive information if they are able to access your database by executing those URLs, malicious URLs. Now another scenario would be a security product integrates with a CM system using webhooks. Now during the creation of a new webhook, the API sends a test request to provided URL. Now attacker here can leverage this flow to request sensitive resources such as cloud metadata services and view the response containing credentials. So if you go to OWASP.org website, there is a very good example of this type of vulnerability that can be exploited by attacker. So imagine if your website is hosted on AWS virtual machine. Now, so in AWS, when you have a virtual machine and you want to connect to other resources in your AWS environment, there is this standard IP they use from their VM to access metadata of the VM, like IAM and security credentials, like EC2 default SSM, right? Now let's imagine an attacker, instead of uploading an image file to your social networking site, uploads this URL instead, right? Website at some point executes this URL, which is supposed to be an image URL. Instead, it will execute this URL, which will fetch the attacker the credentials that you have stored in your VM. So this is a very good example. You can go to this website and check out other examples as well, but this one in particular I wanted to show you. In our sample code, we are going to look into one of the examples, one of the endpoints, the put endpoint, where we are updating the user information by ID, understand the vulnerability that we have in this endpoint, and then fix it. That's all for this lecture, and I will see you in the next one.